everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Great. My name's Suyash Prasad. I work for Audentes. I'm a paediatrician by training and the Chief Medical Officer. I've been there for about 18 months. I'm very pleased to be here. It's the first time I've been attending the MTM-CNM meeting. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we approach the process for a clinical trial. You've heard a lot about some of the wonderful research that's gone on over the past few years, led by Anna and Casey and David, Jocelyn and many others. And we're actually at a critical juncture now. The hope is to start clinical trials for myotubular myopathy using this gene therapy at some point during the course of next year. And there are a number of very important final pieces of the puzzle that need to be completed before we are given the opportunity to start those studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing, a little bit about the work we have yet to do before we can start clinical trials. So I won't talk much about Audentes. My friend and colleague Matt Patterson, who's the CEO, he's not arrived yet. He'll be here a little bit later on this afternoon. He will be speaking a little bit about Audentes and how the organisation has grown and what the philosophy behind the organisation is a little bit later on this evening. I will talk a bit about the importance of partnership and collaboration. As you can see, we have children affected by MTM, families affected, siblings affected by MTM in this room with clinicians and scientific researchers and industry. And when you want to move this kind of a project forward, it needs absolute partnership, collaboration amongst all of us. I'll talk a little bit about how gene therapy is different to a drug. I'll talk about how we need to consider, what we need to consider when we're performing clinical trials in children specifically, what it's like to take part in a clinical trial, what might a clinical trial for MTM might look like, and how you as a family affected by MTM can help as we move the whole process forward. And of course, we'll be happy to take some questions at the end of this session, but also during the course of the next day or two. So who will you meet at the conference? So Matt is attending a bit later on. Barbara is our Vice President of Patient Advocacy. She's your real link, the closest link that you'll have to Audentes. She sat at the back there. So please say hello to Barbara. And Tristan also is in attendance. Tristan Moores heads up our clinical operations group, and she and I work very closely with each other in designing and setting up the clinical trials. We've talked about partnership, talked about collaboration. Many people are stakeholders in this process, and we're proud and privileged to partner with all of you. And of course, importantly, it's really very important for us representing the biotechnology industry to partner with yourselves as patients and families. And you may be aware that over the past year or so, we actually conducted a number of what we call them advisory boards in the US, we call them focus groups in Europe, where we actually bring a group of families who are affected by this condition and really spend a full day talking in depth about what it is that really matters to you. And this helps us inform how we might design the clinical trial. This is important because no one's ever done clinical trials in myotubular myopathy before. And so we're not entirely sure. There's no precedent for the endpoints we should be choosing in this kind of a study. It's not like a blood pressure study or a diabetes study where everybody knows you're supposed to look at particular endpoints. That's not the case for MTM. So the first meeting was in Europe. Here we're very grateful to the six parents who gave their time, and then we repeated the same meeting, and we spent a full day talking in depth with what matters to you as mothers and fathers. Actually, they're all mothers here, but mothers with children with MTM. And some of the things we learned are, not surprisingly, it's a severe and devastating illness, has a major impact on you. Also, not surprisingly, there's often a tortuous path to getting a diagnosis. You might think it's quite straightforward. No, the experts probably think this is straightforward. You have a baby who's born that looks floppy, you send off a mutation test for congenital myopathies, or you wait for a few weeks and do a muscle biopsy. But we heard many stories of mothers whose children weren't diagnosed till well after a year of age. And this is not surprising when you've worked in the rare disease world, and I've had a number of years of experience working in developing treatments for rare orphan disease. We hear this story frequently. So part of our role as a company, and part of your role as well, will be to try and encourage knowledge of this disease. When a therapy is available, we need to really focus very much on encouraging doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals to recognise the symptoms and make a diagnosis early, so we can make a change with the treatment. There are many social burdens. There's a fear of exposing your children to other children who may have other, infections, coughs or colds, and obviously many of you have time on and off work, numerous physical burdens to the family, wheelchairs, ventilators, etc. And interestingly, part of the reason we run these sessions in the US as well as Europe is we actually find some quite major differences in clinical practice, and we actually found that in the US actually there's a lot less support available to families affected by children with a disability. In the UK, for example, every family is given a grant of £30,000 or about $50,000 just to make changes to your house to make it easier. In Germany, 24-hour nursing care is available for most children, whereas it's a little different to how things work in the US. Lots of medical concerns, worries about ventilator use, risks of chest infections, etc. And we also talked a lot about the clinical trial and what families would hope to see from a therapy that's available. And it's kind of interesting because most of the answers really spoke to two domains, that of improving respiratory or ventilatory function, and also that of improving motor function. So we heard stories about mothers wanted their child to be independent from machines, be able to communicate, not need respiratory medicines, breathe independently, be able to talk, be able to sing. We heard stories about how you'd like your child to be able to walk, raise arms above the head to increase functional capability. And it's important for us to hear these stories, because what that does is when we go and speak to the regulatory agencies, to the FDA and the other European agencies, we can say we've spoken to families and we hear these two groupings of symptoms that families would like to have improved. And that helps us select the endpoints for the study. So we are actually focusing very much on respiratory endpoints in the study and motor endpoints in the study. And I can talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. So all the feedback you give us is really very, very helpful, very, very valuable in helping us plan the clinical trial. Okay, so regulatory, this is a big issue. So part of our role as members of industry is to handle the discussions, is to lead the discussions with the FDA in the US and with some of the European agencies. Our clinical trial is going to be run internationally. We will have several centres in the US and several centres in Europe. And we started talking with the agencies in June last year, and we have an ongoing discussion with them, and they give us the permission to run the clinical trials. And this is we met with the French regulators a few months ago, and we put together just to share with you some of what we have to do. We put together huge documents, hundreds of pages of documentation. All the data you hear from David and Casey and Anna, we go through in huge amounts of detail. All the numbers. We send them a big package, and we spend the whole day just before the meeting talking about how we're going to handle the questions and how we can persuade them to allow us to conduct the clinical trial. This was at the German meeting, which was a very successful meeting. You can see myself, you can see Anna joined us. This chap is John, he joined as our head of research and development about a year ago. And John actually, you may or may not be familiar with the haemophilia gene therapy studies that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And John actually designed the vector for the haemophilia gene therapy study. So we're very happy that he's here with us, helping us along with our vector design. So the meetings with the regulators have gone very, very well so far. They're engaged, they ask us a lot of questions, they give us a lot of feedback, and they seem certainly very enthused about our thinking and our planning for the clinical trials, which we're going to start, as I say, next year. So how does gene therapy differ to a traditional medicine? Johan touched on this earlier. Enzymes are protein molecules that do things in the body. Myotubularin is one of the enzymes. The absence or lack of an enzyme can cause a deficit in the capacity of an organ or tissue or cell to function. So the lack of myotubularin, you've already heard, causes a lack of an ability of a muscle to contract. And this is due to a genetic defect. So how can we treat that lack of function? There's several ways. You can give a drug that increases the level of the missing enzyme. Actually, you can also give a drug, now that I'm listening to Johan, that also drops the level of another corresponding enzyme, I guess. I need to alter my slide clearly. You can synthesize the enzyme outside of the body and administer it that way, or you can take a gene therapy approach, which is you can insert the gene into the body, have it migrate to the cells, and have it start producing the myotubularin within the cells. And that's the whole point of a gene therapy approach. It's packaged in virus particles. You've heard the phrase AAV8. It's a type of non-infectious virus that wraps the gene. You infuse millions and millions of these particles. The virus carries the gene to the muscle cells and then delivers its MTM gene within the muscle cells. The gene then starts to produce the missing myotubularin in the body. So that's in a nutshell how gene therapy works. It's a little more complicated than how I've presented it there. In terms of clinical trials, what do we need to do? As I mentioned, we're at a critical juncture. There's a few final things we need to do before we can start clinical trials next year. And I mentioned one of those things, we have to complete our toxicology studies. It's a long process. When you develop a medicine, you start off with a drug discovery in the laboratory, manufacture, preclinical animal studies, proof of concept study in humans, and this is the point at which we are now. Sometimes we need to do larger clinical trials in humans. We hope for a disease like MTM, because it's so rare, we would probably only need to do a small study, which hopefully shows a dramatic improvement. We collate the data, we go through it in detail, file the data with the regulatory agencies, hopefully get a regulatory approval around the world, and then we'll need to do some post-marketing studies to continue to collect safety data in the children that have been treated. So what happens? What do we need? What needs to happen before a clinical trial in patients can occur? Well, we need to ensure appropriate manufacturing rigor. We need to make sure we can make enough of the product. We need to make sure the production system is reliable, it's consistent. We need to make sure the production suite is fully sterile, it's controlled. We need to make sure that the experts making this are appropriately qualified and trained. And ultimately, the production system needs to meet some very, very stringent international standards. This is something called GMP, or Good Manufacturing Practice. What else needs to happen? We need to learn what we can from the preclinical animal work. We're fortunate that we have two animal models. We've got the mouse model, we've got the dog model. The models have some differences between each other, but the gene therapy product seems to work very nicely in both models. And now our challenge is to translate that improvement we see in the mice and the dogs into humans. There are still differences between animals and humans though, so there's still a lot that needs to be done before we can get to that point. There are still more animal studies. Anna, Casey, David are all working on those, which will help inform us further. And as I mentioned, the one key critical study that we need to do is something called a toxicology study. And this is a study that is done. We have to do the toxicology study using the exact same drug that we're going to inject into the humans in the clinical trial. And this is, we give it in what we think is going to be the presumed clinical dose, and we give it in higher doses, 3 times, 5 times, maybe 10 times higher dose, just to see if there's any toxic effects. This is a study that will be done in primates, so in monkeys. This is due to start probably September, October. It depends on how things go with the production of the drug for that from that particular run. Once that's completed, once that data has been shared with the FDA and the regulatory agencies in Europe, we'll be given permission to move forward with the clinical studies. We need to give the science behind the clinical trial some careful consideration. We need to make a number of key decisions. We need to make sure we can practically run the study as well. This is known as clinical trial operations. So what operational decisions need to be made? Where will the trial take place? And we're spending a lot of time meeting with potential investigators around the world. How many centres? Which countries? Which centres? Which specialists? We need to take into account what each clinical trial site's capabilities are. Have the centres run gene therapy studies before? What is the experience of the teams at the clinical centres? Are they used to processing samples of tissue, for example? Are they used to running clinical studies? So myself, Tristan, several other colleagues are spending our time travelling and visiting various centres in the US and in Europe to try and work out where are the best places to run the clinical trial. There's a number of scientific decisions that need to be made. How many patients will take part in the study? Will there be a placebo control, i.e. will some children get a dummy drug and some children get the active drug? What will the inclusion criteria for the study be? What safety monitoring will be performed? What endpoints will be selected and what tests will be done? We also need to select our endpoints, and I mentioned earlier that it seems to us that the respiratory aspects of the disease and the motor aspects of the disease are the most meaningful to patients and families, and so we have to select the right types of respiratory endpoints, the right types of motor function endpoints that we'll use in the study. And in fact, we're doing some concurrent work at this meeting. Barbara Smith's project is looking at a particular respiratory endpoint called MIP, or mean inspiratory pressure. So it's very helpful for us if you take your child along and take part in that, because it's collecting data for what we believe will be an endpoint in the clinical study. The other endpoint we're exploring at this meeting is the active mini, which is being run by Linda and Lindsay from Nationwide Children's Hospital. That's also happening concurrently, and if you can take part while you're at this meeting in helping give them some normative data, that would also be very helpful as we plan our clinical study. An endpoint must be clinically relevant, which is why we speak to you all and find out what's meaningful to you before we actually make our final selection. It also must be responsive, i.e. if we hope to see a change with the gene therapy medication, we want to be able to measure it using the particular endpoint we are selecting. So where are we now from a clinical development perspective? We're in the process of talking with all the regulatory agencies where we plan to run the study, so that's the UK, France, Germany, and the US. We're having ongoing discussions with experts internationally to complete the design of the clinical trial. Animal work is ongoing. Manufacturing work is ongoing, laboratory research is ongoing, and as I say, we're planning to start the clinical trial during the course of 2016. Now, how can you as families affected by MTM contribute to this process? I talked a bit about the need for collaboration, the need for partnership. Well, you can take part in the ongoing research efforts, because all of these help inform the design of the clinical trial and the discussions with the regulators. So we're running a retrospective chart review called the recessive study. It will serve as baseline data and a basis for regulatory discussions. This is a medical chart review, so Alan Beggs is taking the lead on a lot of this work, and I think many of you probably have already your medical charts have been reviewed and they've been entered into this database. But if that's not happened, it's very helpful if you give us consent to be included in that database. So please chat to myself or Tristan or Alan or Casey, who's now taken over from Lindsay, to be involved in that. You can also help us understand other aspects of the disease. You can take part in the physical assessment of motor function for MTM with Nationwide Children's. So Linda and Lindsay are doing that concurrently. You can take part in the observational study of respiratory function. Barbara Smith, Barry Byrne. Talk to Michael Lawler about the CMD tissue repository and role in the CMDIR studies. Sabine Chastenay is running those. We'll be around to answer questions, so please come along and ask us, and I think hopefully we'll have some time for questions now. Thank you very much. We're around, so yeah.